When the sun set over a medieval city, it did not bring peace. It brought fear. Not the dramatic kind you see in stories, but a quiet, practical fear. The kind that told you to bolt your door, lower your voice, and pray nothing went wrong before morning. Because in the Middle Ages, the night did not belong to people. It belonged to fire, to sickness, to thieves, and to things no one could explain. Most medieval cities were never meant to be awake after dark. They were built for daylight survival, trade, prayer, labor, and then sealed shut when the light disappeared. And once the darkness came, the city changed. The bell that ended the day, as dusk approached, bells rang from church towers and gatehouses. This was not a call to worship. It was a warning. The curfew bell. The word itself comes from the old French couvre, feu, cover the fire. When you heard it, you were expected to extinguish open flames, close your shutters, and go inside. Not later, not soon. Immediately. Anyone found wandering the streets without permission after curfew could be detained, fined, beaten, or jailed. And not because the city was cruel. Because the city was terrified of itself. A city built to burn medieval cities were tinderboxes. Houses were made of wood. Roofs were thatched with straw. Buildings leaned into each other so closely that fire could jump streets in seconds. There were no fire departments, no alarms, no coordinated response. If a candle tipped over in the night, the first sign of danger might be smoke creeping into a sleeping family's lungs. By the time someone screamed, it was often too late. Entire neighborhoods burned while people slept. This is why fires were banned after curfew. This is why candles were feared. This is why darkness was preferred to light. A dark city was safer than a bright one. Absolute darkness. Once the fires were covered and candles blown out, medieval cities became places without light. No street lamps. No glowing signs. No illuminated windows. Only moonlight, if the sky allowed it. Most people today have never experienced true darkness. The kind where you cannot see your own hands. Where sound travels farther than sight. In medieval streets, darkness meant danger. Open gutters ran down the center of roads, carrying human waste, animal blood, and refuse. Potholes swallowed feet. Loose animals wandered freely. A single misstep could mean a broken leg. And a broken leg, in the Middle Ages, could be a death sentence. The night belonged to disease. During the day, medieval cities smelled bad. At night, they became lethal. Rats emerged from cellars and walls, feeding on garbage piled in alleyways. Fleas moved with them, invisible and deadly. These were not minor pests. They were carriers of plague. The Black Death did not arrive suddenly. It spread quietly, breath by breath, bite by bite, thriving in the conditions cities created. At night, people were closest together. Families slept packed into single rooms. Sometimes entire households shared one bed. Animals slept indoors for warmth. There was no understanding of bacteria, no concept of airborne disease. If someone coughed beside you in the night, you did not move away, you prayed. No escape after sundown. Once curfew rang, city gates closed. Thick wooden doors reinforced with iron slammed shut. Drawbridges rose. If you were outside when that happened, you were not coming home. You slept where you stood, in fields, under carts, against stone walls. And outside the walls, the dangers were worse. Bandits roamed the countryside. Wild animals circled the edges of settlements. And anyone found wandering after dark could be assumed guilty of something. In a medieval city, being out at night made you suspicious by default. The night watch cities did employ guards. They were called watchmen, poorly paid men armed with staffs, lanterns, and bells. Their job was to patrol streets, call out the hours, and challenge strangers, but they were not police in the modern sense. They had little authority, less training, and no backup. Criminals knew this. If a watchman confronted the wrong person, he might not survive the encounter. Many didn't. Crime without witnesses, most medieval crimes happened at night. Robberies, assaults, murders. If you were attacked after curfew, reporting it meant admitting you broke the law by being outside. Victims often stayed silent. Justice did not favor those who disobeyed rules, even when they were harmed. And if someone disappeared during the night, there was rarely an investigation. No lights, no witnesses, no records. People simply vanished. Indoors was not safe either. Staying inside did not guarantee survival. Homes were overcrowded. Ventilation was poor. Smoke from hearth fires filled rooms. If someone fell sick during the night, there was no doctor to call. Medicine was primitive, pain relief minimal, understanding non-existent. If a family member died before morning, the body remained where it was. You slept beside it. This was normal. Fear was taught, religion reinforced nighttime terror. Sermons warned that demons were strongest after sunset, that witches traveled under cover of darkness, that the devil whispered most clearly when the world went quiet. People believed it, not because they were foolish, but because fear explained what reason could not. Why children died in their sleep, why houses burned without warning, why plague arrived unseen. Darkness made sense of suffering. Why you wouldn't last a night. To survive a night in a medieval city, you would need perfect health, perfect timing, perfect obedience. One mistake. A candle left burning, a step taken too late, a cough in the wrong room could end everything, and no one would save you. There were no sirens, no emergency numbers, no help coming from anywhere else, only morning. If you lived to see it. If disease haunted the medieval night, then fire ruled it. Fire did not knock. It did not wait. And once it started, it did not stop. In a medieval city, fire was not an accident. It was an inevitability. A city designed to burn. Most medieval cities were built quickly, cheaply, and upward. As populations grew, space did not. Houses were stacked tightly together, often sharing walls. Upper floors leaned outward over the street, sometimes nearly touching across the gap. Roofs were made of straw, reeds, or wooden shingles. Walls were timber frames packed with clay and straw. The streets below were narrow, uneven, and cluttered with waste. This was not poor planning. It was survival. Wood was affordable. Stone was expensive. And no one expected buildings to last forever. They just expected to last long enough. Night fires were the worst during the day. Smoke could be seen. People could react. At night, fire moved unseen. A candle knocked over by a sleeping child. A spark from a covered hearth. An ember drifting from a neighboring roof. By the time flames were noticed, they were often already spreading. Smoke crept through houses silently, suffocating people in their sleep before heat ever woke them. Entire families died without realizing anything was wrong. This is why curfews mattered. This is why fires were ordered extinguished at sunset. The night made fire invisible. Fighting fire without tools, there were no fire engines, no hoses, no coordinated response teams. When a fire broke out, church bells rang in alarm. People poured into the streets with buckets, passing water hand to hand from wells or rivers. This method was slow, exhausting, and often useless. If the wind turned, the fire outran them. Many cities accepted a brutal truth. You could not stop a large fire. You could only contain it or flee. Controlled destruction. When flames spread too fast, officials made a decision that sounds unthinkable today. They destroyed houses on purpose. Buildings were torn down to create fire breaks. Homes were sacrificed to save districts. If your house stood in the path of the fire, you might watch guards tear it apart while you begged them to stop. And you would not be compensated. Because the alternative was worse. Cities that burned to the ground. This was not rare. Entire medieval cities burned repeatedly. London suffered dozens of major fires before the Great Fire of 1666. Paris burned so often that entire districts were rebuilt multiple times. Hamburg, Lübeck, and Cologne all experienced catastrophic night fires. Some cities lost more to fire than to war, and every time, people rebuilt the same way, because they had no other choice. Smoke was its own killer. Fire did not need to reach you to kill you. Smoke filled streets and homes, thick with soot and ash. People fled blindly through darkness, coughing, tripping over bodies and debris. Many suffocated before reaching safety. Others jumped into rivers to escape the heat and drowned in panic. Survival depended on where you slept and which way the wind blew. The fear of arson, fire was not always accidental. Criminals used fire as a weapon. Setting a blaze created chaos. Doors were left open. Guards were distracted. Looting followed. In times of unrest, fires were used to punish neighborhoods, target rivals, or destabilize cities. Arson was one of the most feared crimes in the Middle Ages. Punishments were severe. Those caught setting fires were often executed publicly, because fire threatened everyone. Curfew was control, not comfort. Curfews were enforced aggressively. Anyone caught outside after the bell rang without permission could be detained. Why? Because people moving at night were dangerous. They could knock over candles. They could hide crimes. They could start fires intentionally or by accident. Night movement meant unpredictability, and medieval cities hated unpredictability. Locked in, not locked safe, once gates closed and fires were covered, people were trapped inside the city. If a fire broke out, escape routes were limited. Crowds surged through narrow streets, crushing each other in panic. Children were lost. Elderly were trampled, and no one coordinated evacuation. The city had no plan beyond prayer and hope. Bells that meant death, not all bells meant curfew. Some rang only when disaster struck. A specific toll pattern warned of fire. People learned to recognize it instantly, and when they heard it at night, dread followed. You did not know where the fire was, only that it existed, and that it might reach you before dawn. Sleeping through disaster, many medieval deaths happened simply because people slept too deeply. Exhaustion was constant. Labor began at dawn and ended at sunset. When people slept, they slept hard. Smoke overcame them quietly. Entire households were found dead in the morning, bodies untouched by flame. Fire left no second chances. Why you would panic? Modern people imagine themselves reacting quickly. They wouldn't. No light. No directions. No clear exits. You would wake choking, disoriented, unable to see. You would not know which way to run. And neither would anyone else. Rebuilding the same trap. After every fire, cities rebuilt. Often on the same streets. With the same materials. With the same density. Why? Because alternatives were impossible. Stone construction was expensive. Space was limited. Trade demanded proximity. Safety lost to necessity. Fire was part of life. Medieval people accepted fire as inevitable. They feared it. They prayed against it. But they lived knowing it would return. Every night carried the risk. And every morning felt earned. Why you wouldn't last, you are used to. A fire alarms, lie emergency exits, see emergency services alight. Remove all of that. Now add darkness, smoke, panic, and a city designed to trap heat. One night would be enough. When dawn came after a fire, survivors stepped into streets of ash. Charred beams, collapsed roofs, silence, and they began again. Because surviving the night was not victory. It was obligation. When darkness fell over a medieval city, the law went with it. Not officially, not on parchment, but in practice, justice did not patrol the streets after sunset. It hid indoors like everyone else. Because the night belonged to those who understood it. A city without police, there were no police forces in the modern sense. No emergency numbers, no patrol cars, no coordinated response. Law enforcement in medieval cities depended on community obligation. Neighbors watching neighbors, guilds protecting their own, and fear doing the rest. During the day, crowds provided safety. At night, crowds disappeared, and with them, accountability. The night watchmen most cities employed night watchmen. They carried lanterns, bells, and staffs. Their job was to walk the streets, call out the hours, and challenge anyone they encountered. In theory, in reality, they were, one, underpaid, a poorly trained, often elderly or disabled, a frequently drunk. Being a watchman was dangerous and thankless. Many accepted bribes to look the other way. Others simply avoided dark alleys altogether. Criminals knew this. Darkness was an alley at night. The city's layout became a weapon. Narrow streets, sharp corners, hidden courtyards. Perfect places for ambush. There was no lighting to expose attackers. No witnesses to intervene. If you were assaulted, help was unlikely to arrive in time. And even if it did, proving what happened was almost impossible. Crime without consequence. Most medieval crimes committed at night went unpunished. Not because authorities didn't care, but because they couldn't investigate. No fingerprints. No cameras. No reliable records. If someone was robbed or attacked after curfew, they faced an additional problem. They had broken the law by being outside. Victims often stayed silent to avoid punishment themselves. Criminals relied on this. Thieves, not professionals. Survivors, medieval thieves, were rarely career criminals. Most stole out of desperation. Food shortages were common. Work was seasonal. Famine struck without warning. At night, hunger pushed people into risks they wouldn't take during the day. Bread, clothing, firewood. Stealing was often about survival, not wealth. But desperation made violence more likely. Murder was quieter than you think. Medieval murders were rarely dramatic. Most were personal. Arguments over property, family disputes, drunken fights. At night, tempers flared and consequences vanished. A shove in a dark alley, a knife drawn in panic. Bodies were sometimes discovered days later. Others were never found at all. The danger of being a stranger. If you were not known to the neighborhood, you were suspect. At night, strangers were assumed guilty until proven otherwise. Travelers, migrants, and the poor faced immediate danger. Watchmen could detain or beat anyone who looked suspicious. Suspicion required no evidence. It was based on fear. Vigilante justice communities often took justice into their own hands. If a thief was caught, punishment was swift and public. Beatings, branding, mutilation, sometimes execution. Trials could come later, or not at all. Night crimes did not wait for daylight procedures. Locks that barely worked, most medieval doors, were secured with wooden bars or simple iron locks. They were not difficult to break. Windows were unglazed, covered only with shutters or cloth. Intruders could enter quietly. Families slept lightly, listening for footsteps. Every noise meant danger. Domestic violence in the dark violence did not only come from strangers. Homes were not safe havens. Overcrowding, stress, hunger, and alcohol fueled domestic abuse. At night there was no escape, No shelters. No legal protections. Screams were ignored or misunderstood. And morning brought silence, not justice. Alcohol and the night aisle and wine was safer than water, so people drank constantly. At night, intoxication increased. Arguments escalated. Accidents multiplied. Many injuries happened not from crime, but from falls, fights, and poor decisions made in darkness. The law was harsh. When it arrived, when justice did come, it was brutal. Punishments were designed to deter, not rehabilitate. The threat of mutilation or death was meant to replace the absence of policing. Fear was the system, and fear worked during the day. At night, fear simply changed sides. Why you wouldn't outsmart it, modern people believe they would be careful. Stay alert. Avoid danger. But medieval nights offered no safe routes. Every street was unfamiliar. Every sound uncertain. You would not know which alleys to avoid. You would not know who to trust. And hesitation could be fatal. Morning did not bring justice. If you survived the night, the day did not promise answers. Complaints were ignored. Testimony was unreliable. Unless you had status or witnesses, your suffering vanished with the darkness. The city moved on. Fear was a tool authorities knew the night was dangerous. They used that fear. Curfews kept people compliant. Harsh punishments kept order visible. But fear did not protect everyone. It only protected those already safe. Why you wouldn't last, you are used. Fey emergency response. Illegal protections. They lighting anonymity. Remove those. Now add suspicion, silence, and violence without witnesses. One wrong encounter would be enough. The medieval night did not need monsters. People were enough. When the city finally went quiet, it was not peace. It was illness settling in. The medieval night was when bodies failed, when fevers rose, when breath shortened, when death arrived without witnesses, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. A city built for disease. Medieval cities were perfect environments for sickness. Waste flowed through open gutters. Animals lived alongside people. Water came from contaminated wells. During the day, movement diluted danger. At night, everything stagnated. Air stopped moving through narrow streets. Rooms filled with smoke, sweat, and breath. Illness did not need daylight. It waited. The night fever, many medieval illnesses worsened after sunset. Fevers spiked at night. Pain intensified. Delirium set in. Without modern medicine, there were no treatments to stabilize the sick. No IV fluids. No antibiotics. No monitoring. Families watched helplessly as loved ones slipped away between dusk and dawn. Dying without help, doctors did not make house calls at night. Apothecaries were closed. Monasteries were locked. If someone fell critically ill after curfew, they were alone. Even midwives avoided nighttime travel, unless summoned by authority. The night belonged to suffering without witnesses, sleeping beside death in medieval homes. The dead were not removed immediately. If someone died at night, the body stayed where it fell until morning. There were no morgues, no body removal services. Families slept beside corpses. Children woke next to them. This was not trauma. It was routine. Plague did not announce itself. The Black Death did not arrive with warning bells. It crept, a cough in the dark. A fever after sleep. Swollen lymph nodes discovered by candlelight. At night, symptoms worsened unnoticed. Many people died before anyone realized they were sick. Entire households were lost before dawn. Quarantine without mercy. If illness was suspected, doors were marked. Homes were sealed. Guards posted outside to prevent escape. Families were trapped with the sick and dying. At night, screams were ignored. Opening the door meant spreading death. Compassion stopped at the threshold. Mass death was normal. Plague years normalized loss. Gravediggers worked day and night. Bodies were stacked in carts and pits. Burials were rushed or skipped entirely. At night, the dead lay unguarded. Animals fed on corpses. The living learned not to look. The fear of waking up sick, many medieval people went to sleep unsure if they would wake healthy. Nightmares blurred with reality. Sweat-soaked beds, labored breathing, confusion. Morning survival felt like luck. Superstition filled the gaps. Without understanding disease, people blamed a bad air, demons, and divine punishment. The witchcraft nighttime was when these forces were believed strongest. Amulets were worn, candles burned, prayers whispered. Faith became medicine. Hospitals were not safe havens. Medieval hospitals were not places of healing. They were places of isolation. Overcrowded, understaffed, and unsanitary. At night, staff was minimal. Patients died unattended. The night was when hospitals failed most. Childbirth in the dark. Many women gave birth at night. Without sterile tools. Without trained doctors. Complications meant death. For mother. For child. And there was no emergency care coming. Why you would panic, you are used to medical help. To monitors and alarms. To professionals who intervene. Remove all of that. Now imagine waking up unable to breathe, surrounded by darkness, knowing no one is coming. That was normal. Why sleep was dangerous, sleep itself was risky. People died quietly. No alarms, no alerts, just silence. Morning was not relief, dawn revealed bodies. Neighbors discovered losses. Life resumed immediately. Grief had no schedule. Why you wouldn't last, modern survival depends on medicine. Remove it. Add disease, isolation, fear, and night. One fever would be enough. The medieval night did not kill quickly. It killed patiently. And yet, people stayed. Despite the fire, despite the sickness, despite the crime and the darkness, they stayed. Because the medieval city, for all its danger, was still safer than the alternative. The illusion of safety, outside the city walls lay uncertainty. Bandits roamed unchecked. Wild animals hunted freely. Famine struck harder and lasted longer. Inside the city, danger was constant, but predictable. People learned the rules, and in the Middle Ages, rules were survival. Learning the night, children were taught early what not to do. Never run after dark. Never answer unknown voices. Never leave a candle unattended. Never sleep near an open hearth. These were not suggestions. They were lessons written in scars. Community was the only shield. Medieval survival depended on proximity. Neighbors knew each other's footsteps. Strange sounds were noticed immediately. Doors were locked, but walls were thin. Screams were heard. Smoke was smelled. The city was dangerous, but it was together. Isolation was worse. Faith as a survival tool, religion, was not just belief. It was structure. Bells told people when to wake, work, eat, and sleep. Prayer gave meaning to suffering. Ritual replaced control. Faith didn't stop plague or fire, but it gave people a reason to endure them. And endurance mattered more than comfort. The night was respected, not challenged. People did not fight the night. They avoided it. Life was organized to minimize darkness exposure. Work ended early. Social life ended earlier. The city slept because it had to. Those who ignored this rarely survived long. Adaptation, not bravery. Medieval people were not fearless. They were cautious. They adjusted habits to danger, at least sleeping in shifts, keeping animals indoors for warmth and warnings, sharing beds to notice sickness. Early relying on sound instead of sight. Survival was not heroic. It was practical. Why the system worked? Barely cities continued to exist because most nights passed quietly. Disasters were common, but not constant. People accepted loss as part of life. A burned house could be rebuilt, a lost neighbor replaced by another arrival. This sounds cruel, but it was reality. Modern people would fail. You are used to certainty, lights at night, emergency help, medicine, rules that protect individuals. Medieval rules protected the city, not the person. One mistake could cost everything, and no one would intervene. The real reason you wouldn't survive, it wasn't the fire, or the crime, or the disease. It was the silence. No alerts, no warnings, no help coming, only dawn, if you lived long enough to see it. When morning came, survivors stepped into streets carrying ash, blood, and memory. And they did it again, every night, for generations. What the medieval night tells us, the medieval city was not stupid. It was overwhelmed. It faced problems without solutions, and built rules instead. Those rules saved enough people to keep the city alive. But not you. Final thought. You would not survive a night in a medieval city because you were not raised for it. You were not taught to fear darkness. You were not taught to obey bells. You were not taught to accept loss as routine. They were, and that is the difference. They were, and that is the difference. They were raised in a world where danger was not an interruption of life, but its background noise, where fear was not an emergency, but a constant companion, quiet, familiar, almost polite. For medieval people, the night was not something to conquer. It was something to endure. They learned early that survival was not heroic. It was repetitive. It meant doing the same small, careful things every evening without exception. Blow out the candle. Cover the hearth. Bar the door. Say the prayer. Lie down. Every step was a ritual, and every ritual was a shield. Not against death, but against randomness. Because randomness was the true enemy. A medieval child grew up watching adults prepare for night the way soldiers prepare for battle. Quietly, seriously, without drama. There were no stories of bravery told at sunset. Only reminders. Don't go outside. Don't open the door. Don't trust voices you can't see. Don't assume morning will come. And when it did come, it was not celebrated. It was acknowledged. The night shaped the mind as much as it shaped the city. People slept lightly. They listened constantly. A creak of wood. A cough in the dark. The distant shout of a watchman. Sleep was never surrender. It was a negotiation. And many lost that negotiation quietly, without struggle, without witnesses. You would not survive because you are trained to expect intervention. A sound in the night means help is coming. A fire alarm means evacuation. A cough means treatment. For them, a sound in the night meant danger had already arrived. There was no escalation, no second step. The night did not warn you twice. Medieval people did not romanticize the darkness. They did not challenge it. They did not explore it. They organized their entire lives around avoiding it. Work began at dawn not because it was productive, but because daylight was safety. Social life ended early. Doors closed long before sleep. Silence was not emptiness. It was protection. Even celebrations feared the night. Festivals ended before sunset. Music faded with the light. Joy had a curfew. And yet, despite all of this, they did not see themselves as trapped. They saw themselves as realistic. The medieval world did not promise happiness. It promised continuity. You lived so that life could continue, through you or after you. Survival was not about the individual. It was about the household, the street, the city. If one person died quietly in the night, the city still lived. That was considered success. This is where modern minds break. You expect safety to be personal. You expect systems to protect you. Medieval systems protected the whole, even if that meant sacrificing parts. Curfews did not exist to save individuals caught outside. They existed to prevent fires that could kill thousands. Quarantines did not exist to comfort the sick. They existed to stop cities from collapsing. Justice did not aim to be fair. It aimed to be visible. And visibility was enough. People adapted to this reality until it became normal. Children learned which streets were safe, which sounds mattered, which didn't. Adults memorized escape routes they hoped never to use. Everyone knew which neighbor was sick, which house smelled wrong, which door had been closed too long. The city was read like a living body, and at night, any change could mean infection. You would not survive because you would hesitate. You would assume help existed. You would wait for instructions. You would look for signs. They didn't. They acted immediately or not at all, because hesitation was deadly. The medieval knight rewarded obedience, not intelligence. The smartest person could still die from smoke in their sleep. The strongest could still fall in the dark. The bravest could still bleed out unseen. Only the cautious lasted. Only those who respected the night survived it, and so they built a culture around restraint. Don't stand out. Don't provoke attention. Don't move unnecessarily. Blend into the rhythm of the city. The medieval city did not care who you were. It cared whether you followed its rules. By morning, survivors emerged slowly. They didn't rush outside. They listened first, smelled the air, checked for smoke, counted the sounds. A morning was a verification, not a relief. Another night had passed. That was enough. We look back at this world and call it cruel. And it was. But it was also honest. It did not pretend safety was guaranteed. It did not hide death behind walls and systems. It placed danger in plain sight and forced people to adapt or disappear. That is why you would not survive a night in a medieval city. Not because you are weaker, not because you are less intelligent, but because you were raised in a world that promised you something the medieval city never did, that tomorrow is expected. For them, tomorrow was earned. Night by night, rule by rule, mistake by mistake. The bells rang each evening not to comfort, but to remind. Darkness was coming, and survival depended on how seriously you took it. They took it seriously enough to build cities that lasted centuries. You would last a night only if the city allowed you to, and medieval cities were not forgiving. They were patient. They were indifferent, and they always waited for the sun to rise, with or without you. And when the sun finally did rise, it did not rise gently. It crept over rooftops scarred by smoke, over streets still damp with waste and ash, over doors that opened slowly, as if the night might still be listening. Morning in a medieval city was not a celebration. It was an inspection. People did not step outside immediately. They leaned out of windows. They listened. Was there shouting? Was there the smell of smoke? Was there an unnatural quiet where sound should be? Only then did they emerge. The city revealed what the night had taken. A body slumped against a wall, already stiff. A door broken inward, its owner nowhere to be found. A house blackened by fire. Neighbors gathered in silence, counting who was missing. No one asked why it happened. Only how much. Loss was measured, not questioned. This was the rhythm medieval people learned to live with. Day was for repair. Night was for endurance. During the day, streets were cleaned as best they could be. Waste was shoveled aside. Ash was swept away. Walls were patched with whatever materials remained. The city healed just enough to face the next sunset, and everyone knew it was temporary. Children learned quickly not to ask questions about the night. If someone did not wake up, the answer was always the same. It was their time. Not because people believed fate was kind, but because believing otherwise was unbearable. You cannot mourn every loss fully when loss is constant. So grief was rationed. People adapted in ways that seem unthinkable now. They learned to sleep through screams, to ignore sounds that did not concern their own household, to accept that intervention was often more dangerous than inaction. Helping someone at night could mean breaking curfew. Breaking curfew could mean punishment. Punishment could mean death. So morality bent under survival, not because people were cruel, but because cruelty was already everywhere. You would struggle most with this, not the filth, not the darkness, not even the fear, but the absence of rescue. You are trained to escalate problems, to call someone, to expect response. In a medieval city, escalation was a risk. The safest choice was often silence. The night taught people restraint. Don't light the candle. Don't raise your voice. Don't attract attention. Attention was dangerous. If a watchman noticed you, you might be questioned. If neighbors noticed you, they might suspect you. If authorities noticed you, they might punish you. Remaining unnoticed was survival. Even wealth did not guarantee safety. Nobles slept behind thicker walls, but fire burned stone as easily as wood once it took hold. Guards could be bribed or overwhelmed. Disease did not care about status. Darkness did not respect rank. At night, everyone was reduced to the same vulnerability. This is why medieval people invested so heavily in routine. Routine removed choice. Choice invited error. By doing the same things every evening, in the same order, without deviation, they minimized risk. Ritual was not superstition. It was risk management. The modern world often laughs at medieval fear, at bells, at curfews, at prayers whispered in the dark. But those fears were not irrational. They were calibrated. They came from watching neighbors die, from smelling smoke too late, from waking up sick and knowing no one was coming. Fear was information. Over generations, this shaped behavior so deeply that it became invisible. People stopped thinking about why they did things. They simply did them. Close the door, bar the window, lie still. The city taught them how to survive and punished those who forgot. You would not survive because you would try to reason with the night. You would assume exceptions. Assume flexibility. Assume mercy. The medieval city offered none of these. It was not evil. It was indifferent. It did not adapt to you. You adapted to it, or you didn't. By the time sunrise arrived, those who had survived the night did not feel victorious. They felt relieved. Relief was the highest emotion the medieval city offered. Not joy, not pride. Relief. And then the day began again. Work resumed. Markets opened. Children played in streets that had been killing grounds hours before. Life continued because it had to. There was no alternative. This is why medieval cities lasted as long as they did. Not because they were safe, but because people learned to coexist with danger instead of pretending it could be eliminated. They accepted risk as permanent. We do not. We build systems to remove danger. They built habits to live with it. And that difference matters, because when systems fail, when lights go out, when help doesn't arrive, when order collapses, we panic. They did not. They had already learned how to survive without reassurance. That is why, if you were dropped into a medieval city at night, you would not die because you made a dramatic mistake. You would die because you made a small one. A candle lit too long. A step taken too late. A door opened at the wrong sound. The medieval night punished precision errors, and it punished them permanently. The city would not remember you. Your death would not be recorded. Your name would not be written down. By morning, the street would be swept, the door repaired, the space filled. The city endured. You did not. And that, more than anything, is why you wouldn't survive a night in a medieval city. Not because it was cruel, but because it was honest about what survival cost. It demanded obedience. It demanded silence. It demanded humility before darkness. And it demanded it every single night. Forever. And even that was not the end of it. Because the medieval night did not only shape behavior, it reshaped identity. People did not think of themselves as individuals moving through a city. They thought of themselves as parts of it. Organs in a body that could not afford infection. To survive the night, you had to disappear into the system. Names mattered less than roles. You were a baker, a tanner, a servant, a widow, and each role came with expectations about where you were allowed to be when the sun went down. Bakers rose before dawn and slept early. Tanners lived near the edge of town, where the smell could be tolerated. Servants slept where they were told. Widows were watched closely. The night enforced these categories. If you were found where you didn't belong, the city assumed intent. And intent was punished. This is another reason you would not survive. You are used to moving freely, to walking at night without explaining yourself, to existing without justification. In a medieval city, presence required permission, and permission expired at sunset. Even silence had rules. Laughing too loudly at night could bring suspicion. Singing was dangerous. Arguments were cut short, not resolved. Noise meant attention. Attention meant risk. So emotions were managed carefully. Anger was swallowed. Grief was muted. Joy was postponed. The night was not a time for feeling. It was a time for control. Windows were covered not just to keep cold out, but to keep light in. A visible flame after curfew could attract guards, or thieves, or worse, accusations. Light meant life, and life meant something worth taking. So families sat in darkness, memorizing the shapes of their own rooms, waiting. Waiting was the core skill of survival. Waiting for morning. Waiting for danger to pass. Waiting for sickness to decide. The medieval night taught patience as a necessity, not a virtue. Act too soon, and you risked exposure. Act too late, and you were already dead. The city also trained people to accept uncertainty. You might hear footsteps outside your door and never know whose they were. You might smell smoke and never learn where it came from. You might hear a scream and never discover who it belonged to. Not knowing was normal. Closure was rare. This constant uncertainty produced something we struggle with today. Acceptance without explanation. People did not demand answers from the night. They endured it. The question was never why did this happen? It was how do we prevent it next time? And often, the answer was simply follow the rules more carefully. Rules multiplied because they worked just enough. Don't dump waste after sunset. Don't walk alone. Don't open doors for anyone you can't identify. Don't light fires without necessity. Some of these rules saved lives. Some did nothing. But together, they created a sense of order. And order, even false order, reduced panic. You would likely rebel against this. You would question the logic, test the boundaries, assume exceptions. Medieval cities did not tolerate testing. They tolerated compliance. It is tempting to think that medieval people lived in constant terror. They didn't. Terror is exhausting. Instead, they lived in a state of controlled vigilance. A low, steady awareness that danger existed, and that it was manageable if respected. This made them calm in ways we often aren't. When everything is dangerous, nothing is surprising. This is why medieval people could sleep. Not deeply, not comfortably, but consistently. They accepted risk as background noise. You are trained to notice danger because it is rare. They ignored it because it was constant. And this difference is fatal. Drop a modern person into a medieval night, and their instincts betray them. They would seek reassurance. Seek confirmation. Seek clarity. The medieval night offered none. If you knocked on a door for help, it might stay closed. Not out of cruelty, but out of fear. Opening a door at night could doom an entire household. Compassion had boundaries, and survival drew them. By the time the bells rang again at dawn, the city had already judged the night. Not in words, in absences. Which windows stayed closed, which doors never opened, which voices were missing. The city counted loss silently. Then it moved on. This is the final reason you would not survive. You expect loss to be acknowledged, to be documented, to matter. In a medieval city, loss mattered only if it threatened stability. 1 death was tragedy. 10 were misfortune. 100 were a crisis. Below that threshold, the city absorbed pain and continued. The medieval night was not designed for you. It was designed for endurance, for repetition, for systems that outlived individuals. And those systems succeeded at the cost of countless unnamed lives. When we imagine the past, we often imagine heroism, swords, battles, defiance. But the real heroism of medieval life was quieter. It was staying inside, following rules, accepting limits. It was surviving not by standing out, but by blending in. So, when you ask why you wouldn't survive a night in a medieval city, the answer is not dramatic. You wouldn't be executed. You wouldn't be hunted. You would simply fail to adapt. You would treat the night as a challenge. They treated it as a condition. The medieval city did not care if you understood it. It only cared whether you obeyed it. And obedience, in the dark, was the difference between waking up and becoming part of the silence the next morning. Because in the medieval world, the night did not need to kill everyone. It only needed to kill enough, and it did. And even then, the city did not pause to reflect on what it had done. There were no memorials for those the night claimed. No plaques on walls. No anniversaries marked on calendars. The medieval city did not remember individuals. It remembered patterns. If fires happened too often in one district, new rules appeared. If crime increased in certain streets, curfews tightened. If sickness returned each winter, prayers multiplied. Memory was practical, not sentimental. This is another way the night trained its people. They learned to think statistically without knowing the word. They understood risk without measuring it. They knew which nights were worse, cold ones when smoke lingered, wet ones when disease spread, windless ones when fire trapped itself between walls. They did not need forecasts. They watched the sky. Weather mattered more at night than during the day. Rain could save a city from burning. Fog could hide thieves. Wind could turn a single flame into catastrophe. A calm, dry night was the most dangerous of all. It felt safe, and safety invited mistakes. People learned to fear comfort. A warm room meant fire. A quiet street meant absence. A locked door meant isolation. Too much ease signaled vulnerability, so even rest was measured. Beds were hard. Blankets were thin. Sleep was shallow. Comfort dulled awareness, and awareness was life. Children absorbed this logic without being taught. They grew up watching adults pause before lighting candles, listening before opening doors, freezing at unfamiliar sounds. Fear was modeled behavior. By adolescence, it was instinct. This instinct is what you lack. You live in a world that teaches confidence, that rewards initiative, that celebrates action. The medieval knight punished all three. Confidence made you visible. Initiative made you unpredictable. Action made you noticed. And being noticed after dark was rarely good. Imagine yourself lying in a medieval bed. No mattress as you know it. No insulation. No silence. The city creaks around you. Wood shifts. Animals move. Someone coughs nearby. You do not know if that cough means illness, or death, or nothing at all. You do not get up to check. Checking creates movement. Movement creates noise. Noise creates consequences. So you lie still. This stillness is not peace. It is discipline. Hours pass slowly. Time stretches in the dark. There are no clocks within reach. Only bells, distant and infrequent. You measure time by sound, by the number of breaths between noises, by how long the fear holds steady. If it fades, you may sleep. If it sharpens, you remain awake. This is how nights are survived. At some point, exhaustion wins. It always does. And this is when the city becomes most dangerous. Sleep blurs awareness. Dreams distort sound. Reality slips. Many medieval deaths happened in this state. Not fully asleep, not fully awake. Too slow to react. Too tired to understand. You might dream of fire and wake to smoke too late. You might dream of voices and ignore the real ones. You might dream of safety and forget that safety is temporary. The medieval knight exploited weakness quietly. It did not rush. Those who survived longest were not the strongest, but the most consistent. They did not change habits. They did not improvise. They trusted routine over instinct. Instinct is emotional. Routine is mechanical, and machines do not panic. This is why the city shaped people into parts. Not because individuality was hated, but because predictability was prized. If everyone did the same things at the same times, risk decreased. Chaos shrank. The city became legible. When something broke that pattern, the city reacted harshly. Not out of malice, but out of fear. An open door after curfew. A fire left uncovered. A figure moving where none should be. These were threats. Not because they were evil, but because they were unknown. You live in a world that tolerates unknowns. The medieval city could not afford that luxury. Unknowns killed people. By now, you may be wondering why anyone stayed. Why not leave? Many did. They fled to the countryside, to monasteries, to wandering lives, and many of them died there instead. Outside the city, danger was less concentrated, but more random. Inside, it was constant, but understood. Humans choose known danger over unknown danger every time. This is why cities grew, not because they were safe, but because they were familiar. You knew what to fear. And when? So the night became a shared enemy, something everyone prepared for together, even if they faced it alone. That shared understanding created community. Not warmth, not kindness, but solidarity. In the end, the medieval city did not defeat the night. It negotiated with it. It limited its reach, contained its damage, accepted its losses. This was enough. You, however, expect victory. You expect danger to be eliminated. You expect systems to win. The medieval world did not promise winning. It promised continuation. If you were dropped into a medieval city tonight, you would ask the wrong questions. You would ask where help was, where safety was, where protection came from. They would not understand the question. Help was not external. It was behavioral. Safety was not guaranteed. It was earned. Protection did not arrive. It was practiced. You would struggle to learn this fast enough. And the night would not slow down for you. It never did, because the medieval night was not cruel. Cruelty implies intent. The night was simply present. It existed, and survival depended entirely on whether you accepted that fact before it tested you. Most people learned over years. You would have one night, and that was never enough. And the night would not explain itself. It never did. There were no lessons delivered gently, no warnings tailored to the unprepared. The medieval night taught only by consequence. Those who survived understood this without words. Those who didn't were simply removed from the pattern. If you stayed long enough, you would begin to feel it. The way the city tightened as dusk approached. The subtle change in movement. The collective slowing. Shops closed early not out of laziness, but out of caution. Voices lowered. Doors shut one by one. The city exhaled, not in relief, but in readiness. Nightfall was a posture. You would notice how quickly streets emptied. Not gradually. Abruptly. One moment people were there. The next, they were gone. As if the city had blinked. Anyone still outside after that moment felt exposed, like standing in an open field during a storm. Visibility was danger. The city gates closed with a sound that echoed too long. Wood against stone. Iron against iron. That sound meant finality. Whatever you were outside of, you would remain outside until morning. And if you were inside, you stayed inside, no matter what you heard. This was the hardest lesson to learn. You might hear footsteps running. You might hear a voice calling for help. You might hear someone pounding on a door, and you would do nothing. Not because you were heartless, but because the cost of compassion could be total. Open the door, and you invited the unknown. Disease, criminals, guards who might accuse you of harboring someone illegally. So doors stayed shut. The night demanded boundaries. This is where modern morality collapses. You are taught to intervene, to assist, to respond. The medieval city taught restraint. Helping one person could endanger many, and the city always chose the many. Over time, people internalized this logic so deeply that it stopped feeling cruel. It became neutral. The same way weather is neutral, a storm does not hate you. It simply does what storms do. The night was the same. You would also struggle with how little information existed. No announcements, no explanations. If someone disappeared, you might never know why. Rumors filled the gaps. Stories spread in whispers. Fear multiplied in silence. And silence was constant. The medieval city did not value transparency. It valued stability. Truth was less important than calm. Panic killed faster than ignorance. So uncertainty was tolerated, even encouraged. This is another reason the night was deadly. People did not rush to investigate strange events. They avoided them. A dark alley remained dark. A burned house remained unspoken of. A missing neighbor became a memory without details. Attention was dangerous. If you stayed long enough, you would stop asking questions too. Not because you understood everything, but because understanding was unnecessary. Compliance was enough. The medieval night also erased ambition. No one planned big changes after sunset. No revolutions began in the dark. Change required daylight, crowds, visibility. The night preserved the status quo. That was part of its function. Even rebellion respected curfews. Rebels slept, because tired rebels make mistakes. And so the city endured, night after night, century after century. Not because it conquered danger, but because it learned to live alongside it. This is the final thing you would fail to grasp. You believe survival is about eliminating risk. The medieval city knew survival was about managing it. They did not seek safety. They sought predictability. Predictability meant a knowing when not to move, knowing when not to speak, knowing when not to help. Knowing when to wait. Waiting saved more lives than action ever did. When morning finally returned, it felt less like a victory and more like permission. Permission to breathe louder. To move freely. to acknowledge each other again. Daylight was not happiness, it was allowance, and the people who stepped into the light did not carry gratitude. They carried readiness, because they knew night would come again. Always. If you had survived that first night, somehow, you might believe the worst was over. You would be wrong. The first night only taught the rules. The second night tested whether you remembered them. And the third punished anyone who didn't. Survival in a medieval city was cumulative. Mistakes stacked. Fatigue accumulated. Luck ran out. Few people died in spectacular ways. Most died quietly, after one error too many. You are used to resets. A bad night followed by a new day. A mistake corrected. A system forgiving error. The medieval city did not reset. It remembered. Not consciously, but structurally. Weaker habits disappeared with their owners. Stronger habits remained. This was natural selection at the scale of behavior. So, when we say you wouldn't survive a night in a medieval city, we don't mean you would die immediately. We mean you would not adapt fast enough. You would bring expectations that the night could not meet. And the night would not negotiate. It never had, and it never needed to. Because the medieval night was not something to be beaten. It was something to be respected. Those who understood, that lived long enough to teach it to the next generation. Those who didn't became part of the silence the city swept away at dawn. And that is where the story always ends. Not with screams, not with drama, but with quiet. The quiet of a door that never opens again. The quiet of a street that feels slightly emptier. The quiet of a city that survived because it learned, again and again, that the night does not care who you are, only whether you obey it. And after a while, the quiet stopped feeling heavy. It became familiar. The medieval city taught people to live with absence the way we live with noise, noticing it only when it changed. A street felt wrong not because it was dangerous, but because it was different. One fewer footstep. One window that stayed closed too long. One door that did not open at dawn. These small irregularities were how the city mourned. Silently. Briefly. Then not at all. You would struggle with this kind of loss. You are used to names, to explanations, to ceremonies. The medieval city offered none. Death did not pause the schedule. Markets still opened. Work still demanded hands. A missing person created inconvenience, not reflection. Someone else would fill the space. This was not cruelty. It was arithmetic. A city that stopped to grieve every night would never function, so grief was compressed, felt quickly, then buried under routine. Even families adapted to this rhythm. Children learned not to ask where someone had gone. They learned which questions had no answers. Adults learned to look away without guilt. Survival required emotional efficiency. You would call this heartless. They called it necessary. Because a city that feels too deeply does not survive. The medieval night also trained people to trust habit over hope. Hope is passive. Habit is active. You can hope nothing goes wrong. Or you can make sure fewer things can go wrong. So people built habits that bordered on obsession. Doors checked twice. Fires checked 3 times. Children counted before sleep. If something bad happened, it was assumed someone skipped a step. And that belief, whether true or not, kept people disciplined. You would want certainty. You would want proof. The medieval city functioned on assumption. Assumption was faster. This is why medieval rules multiplied. Not because leaders loved control, but because each rule represented a mistake someone had already paid for. Curfews existed because fires had burned cities down. Quarantines existed because disease had emptied streets. Punishments existed because fear was cheaper than enforcement. Rules were scars turned into instructions. At night, those instructions mattered most, because the night erased margin for error. If you watched a medieval household closely, you would see the same sequence repeated every evening. The same motions. The same order, almost religious, not because they believed it was sacred, but because deviation invited disaster. Over time, this repetition shaped identity. People stopped seeing themselves as decision makers. They were performers in a routine older than they were, and this was comforting. Choice is exhausting. Routine is light. You would resist this. You would feel constrained, reduced, unfree. They felt protected. Because freedom without safety is meaningless. The medieval city also erased the idea of privacy at night. Walls were thin. Sounds traveled. Everyone knew when someone was sick, when someone argued, when someone cried. At night, secrecy was impossible, and secrecy was dangerous. The city preferred visibility during the day and invisibility at night. This balance kept it alive. As centuries passed, people forgot why some rules existed. They followed them anyway. Because rules did not need justification to function. They only needed repetition. This is something we struggle with now. We demand reasons. They demanded results, and results were visible. Cities still stood. People still lived. That was enough. If you stayed long enough, months, not nights, you might begin to adapt. Your movements would slow. Your voice would lower. You would stop reacting emotionally to every sound. You would learn which noises mattered. Most didn't. You would learn to distinguish danger from discomfort. This is another skill we lack. We treat discomfort as danger. They treated danger as discomfort, until it wasn't. Eventually, the night would stop feeling hostile. Not because it became safe, but because you learned its language. The creak that meant wind. The footstep that meant patrol. The cough that meant sickness. Understanding replaced panic. But reaching this stage required time, and most people never had enough. Plague cut lives short. Fire erased households. Violence ended routines abruptly. Adaptation was always incomplete. This is why survival was uneven. Some families endured for generations. Others vanished without trace. The difference was rarely intelligence or strength. It was consistency. You would not survive long enough to become consistent. You would make small errors. You would treat the night as temporary. They treated it as permanent. This is the deepest misunderstanding. You believe the night ends in morning. They believe the night returns. And anything that returns must be respected. So the medieval city did not dream of light conquering darkness. It dreamed of balance, day for action, night for restraint, and survival lived in the space between. When we look back at medieval life, we often focus on its brutality, but its real defining feature was discipline. A discipline shaped by night. You are not less capable than medieval people. You are just trained for a different world. A world where systems compensate for error, where help arrives, where night is aesthetic, not lethal. Remove those systems, and the difference becomes fatal. That is why, if you were placed in a medieval city at sunset, your fate would not be decided by monsters, or villains, or fate. It would be decided by habit, and your habits were not made for that world. The medieval city would not reject you. It would simply wait, night after night, until the rules you ignored became the reason your door never opened again. And by morning, the city would continue, as it always had, because medieval cities were not built to protect people. They were built to survive them. And in the end, that is what the medieval night truly was. Not an enemy, not a monster, Not a test of courage, it was a filter, a slow, indifferent force that shaped cities by removing those who could not adapt to its rhythm. The medieval city did not ask who you were. It did not care what you believed. It did not reward intelligence, strength, or ambition. It rewarded obedience. The night did not need to hunt you. It only needed to wait. Wait for a candle left burning. Wait for a door opened at the wrong sound. Wait for a step taken too late, or a cough ignored too long. And when the mistake came, as mistakes always do, the city absorbed it without comment. There was no outrage, no investigation, no lessons written down, only adjustment, a new rule, a stricter curfew, a heavier punishment. The city learned, you did not. This is why medieval cities survived centuries of fire, plague, and violence. They did not protect individuals. They protected patterns, and patterns endure longer than people ever do. When we imagine the past, we imagine darkness as something to be overcome. But medieval people understood something we have forgotten. Darkness does not need to be defeated. It only needs to be respected. They did not dream of safer nights. They organized their lives so that nights mattered less. They limited movement. They limited noise. They limited choice. And in doing so, they limited risk. Just enough. You live in a world that promises protection. They lived in a world that demanded caution. You trust systems to intervene. They trusted habits to prevent. You expect safety to be provided. They accepted that safety had to be practiced every night. Without exception. If you were placed in a medieval city at sunset, nothing dramatic would happen at first. No alarms, no immediate danger, just a city growing quieter, tighter, more watchful. And that is when it would begin to work against you. You would feel the silence and misunderstand it. You would mistake stillness for peace, darkness for emptiness. You would assume time was on your side. It would not be. The medieval night did not punish rebellion. It punished forgetfulness. Forgetting to listen. Forgetting to wait. Forgetting that survival was never guaranteed. By morning, if you were still alive, you would not feel triumphant. You would feel instructed. And that instruction would come too late. The people who lived there did not survive because they were braver than you. They survived because they were shaped from childhood by a world that never pretended to be safe. They did not expect the night to spare them, so they behaved as if it never would. That is the difference. They were not protected by their cities. Their cities were protected from them, and the night was the price everyone paid for living inside walls that promised daylight. So when you ask why you wouldn't survive a night in a medieval city, the answer is simple and final. You would wait for safety. They never did. They prepared instead. And the night rewarded only those who understood that preparation was the closest thing to mercy the medieval world would ever offer.